Here's the rewritten script with channel references and subscription prompts removed. Something absolutely historic is unfolding in real time. In the last 72 hours, Canada has done something no one predicted with this level of speed, this level of precision, or this level of defiance. Canada, your friendly, hockey-loving, politely worded neighbor to the north, has just announced one of the largest military buildups in its peacetime history. Not in response to Russia, not in response to China, in response to the President of the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the mainstream news is giving you the highlights. We're giving you the architecture. Rewind 72 hours. On Thursday, March 12th, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood inside the 440 Transport Squadron hangar in Yellowknife, in Canada's Northwest Territories, one of the coldest, most remote corners of the country. And he didn't just make a speech, he issued a declaration of independence. With this plan, Carney told the assembled crowd, we are taking control of our future. We will no longer rely on others to defend our Arctic security or to fuel our economy. We are taking full responsibility for defending our sovereignty. Others. He didn't say Russia, he didn't say China, he said others. Everyone in that hangar, and every diplomat watching from Washington, knew exactly what that meant. Within the same 48-hour window, Carney flew to Bardufoss, Norway, above the Arctic Circle, to stand alongside the leaders of Norway and Germany and watch 32,000 NATO troops drill in sub-zero conditions. The message to Washington could not have been clearer if it had been written in the snow in 10-foot letters. Canada is done waiting. Canada is building. And Canada is not building alone. Here are the three announcements at the center of this story, and why each one represents a direct countermove to specific actions taken by the Trump administration. Announcement 1. $35 billion for Arctic military infrastructure. Canada is spending $35 billion Canadian dollars to overhaul its entire Arctic military infrastructure. This is not a proposal. This is not a campaign promise. The money has been identified, the projects have been named, and the construction timeline has been set. Approximately $32 billion of this total will go directly toward upgrading four major forward operating locations: Yellowknife, Inuvik, Iqaluit, and 5 Wing Goose Bay Air Base in Labrador. The upgrades include runway improvements to accommodate Canada's new F-35 fighter jets, new hangars, ammunition compounds, fuel facilities, and expanded housing for personnel. That's not maintenance, that's transformation. Canada is also building 2 entirely new northern operational support hubs, one in Whitehorse, Yukon, and one in Resolute, Nunavut, backed by an additional $267 million. 2 more northern operational support nodes are being established in Cambridge Bay and Rankin Inlet. Together, these installations create a rapid deployment network, allowing Canadian Armed Forces to operate year-round across the entire Arctic, including in locations so remote they've historically been considered strategically unreachable. The Pentagon's own assessment had long flagged vulnerabilities in Canada's Arctic posture. That assessment, delivered to Ottawa informally through NORAD channels, is now being answered loudly, publicly, and without asking Washington's permission. Here's the number that matters most. This level of investment will, for the first time, enable the Canadian Armed Forces to defend the Arctic without the help of allies. That phrase appears in the official government press release. Read it again. Without the help of allies. That is a country choosing independence over dependence. That is a country that looked south, saw what was coming, and decided to build its own floor. Announcement 2. Canada's National Sovereign Satellite Program. This is the part the financial press has underreported, and it matters enormously. One of the most significant strategic vulnerabilities Canada identified over the past year, as relations with Washington deteriorated, was its over-reliance on American commercial satellite infrastructure for Arctic surveillance, communications, and intelligence gathering. In a conflict scenario, that infrastructure is controlled by U.S. private entities that can theoretically be instructed not to cooperate. The Carney government's response is a national sovereign satellite program, hundreds of satellites as part of what officials describe as a national defense agenda. Canada's 2025 budget committed $80.8 billion to defense overall, with a significant allocation to the Borealis program, an initiative combining artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced surveillance technologies, with an initial $68.2 million over 3 years just for the coordination and research hub network. Canada is building eyes in the sky that no one in Washington can turn off. Think about what that means strategically. Think about what it says about how Ottawa now views its relationship with Washington. This is not a defensive crouch. This is a strategic pivot. Announcement 3. A new Arctic security architecture. On Friday, March 13th, Carney stood at a podium in Bardufoss, Norway, flanked by Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And the three of them made clear, together, in front of cameras, that the Arctic now has its own security architecture. And that architecture does not depend on American leadership. The three leaders were asked directly about Donald Trump's threats to seize Greenland, a sovereign territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. Norwegian Prime Minister Støre's response was unambiguous. Any attempt to claim that one country can take land from another is unacceptable under international law, and especially unheard of among allies. Then Carney stepped to the microphone. We are fully prepared, individually and collectively, to defend the Arctic and the High North. Full stop. This was not a diplomatic hedge. This was three Western leaders standing above the Arctic Circle, surrounded by 32,000 NATO troops conducting live-fire Arctic drills, an exercise called Cold Response 2026, running March 9th through March 19th, saying clearly that the territorial integrity of NATO allies is non-negotiable, including, implicitly, Canada's own. Now let's talk about what's happening inside Washington, because the chaos there is directly fueling Canada's urgency. The Supreme Court struck down Trump's primary tariff tool, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, in a 6-3 ruling last month. The conservative-led court found that the Constitution very clearly gives Congress, not the President, power over taxes and tariffs. That ruling wiped out the Liberation Day tariffs, the fentanyl-related duties on Canada, Mexico, and China, and the broader framework Trump had used to wage his global trade war. Trump's response? He didn't accept the ruling. He didn't go back to Congress. He pivoted, invoking Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act to impose a 10% worldwide tariff. Section 122 is limited. It caps at 15% and expires after 150 days unless Congress votes to extend it. An extension is considered highly unlikely to receive congressional approval. But that's not even the most alarming part. The Trump administration has now launched Section 301 investigations into 60 countries, including Canada, under the guise of unfair trade practices and forced labor. Section 301 is the tool Trump is now using to try to rebuild his tariff agenda from the legal rubble the Supreme Court left behind. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told CNBC this week, "We are trying to move very quickly, in a matter of months. A matter of months, before the Section 122 tariffs expire in July, before Congress can act, before trading partners can organize. This is not a trade policy. This is a sprint to rearm a weapon that was just ruled illegal before anyone can stop it, and Canada knows it." Canada's trade surplus with the United States was $5.4 billion in January 2026, according to Statistics Canada. Here's the part the White House conveniently omits. The vast majority of that surplus is oil and energy, the fuel that heats American homes and powers American refineries. Experts at the Cato Institute noted this week that it would be difficult for a Section 301 investigation to conclude that tariffs on Canada are necessary, given the nature of that trade balance. Canada isn't flooding the U.S. market with cheap manufactured goods. Canada is selling America the energy it cannot produce enough of on its own. Dependency runs both ways. That is the single most important thing to understand about this conflict. Now let's talk about the broader geopolitical picture, because this isn't just about tariffs or the Arctic. It is about a world sliding toward catastrophe across multiple simultaneous theaters. Russia and Iran are operating as a de facto military alliance. That is no longer an analytical claim. It is a stated reality. The result? American soldiers and American interests in the Middle East are being targeted, in part, through Russian-enabled Iranian capabilities. 6 of the 7 G7 nations, every member except the United States, voted against lifting sanctions on Russia, making their position clear in a video conference on Wednesday, March 11th. The next morning, Washington announced it was lifting them anyway. German Chancellor Merz said at the Bardufoss press conference, "We were a little bit surprised that we heard this morning that the American government decided differently. This is definitely not our view." He paused. "We should put more pressure on Russia to bring this terrible war to an end as soon as possible." Carney's response when his turn came, "Canada will maintain sanctions on Russia. Full stop. Including sanctions on the Shadow Fleet, the network of tankers quietly moving Russian oil around Western restrictions, 6 allies, 1 bloc, 1 unified position, and Washington on the other side of it. Here's what this means for you, because it's not abstract, it's not theoretical. It's already in your economy, your supply chain, your energy bill. If you live in the American Midwest, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, your manufacturing supply chains are structurally integrated with Canadian industry. Auto parts, steel, aluminum, agricultural equipment. The Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum are already adding costs to U.S. manufacturers. If Section 301 leads to broader tariffs on Canadian goods, those costs increase again. Your car gets more expensive, your appliances get more expensive, and the companies making those products start looking for ways to move production, not back to the US, but somewhere the tariff risk is lower. If you're in the energy sector, Texas, Oklahoma, the Gulf Coast, consider this. Canadian oil currently accounts for roughly 60% of US crude oil imports. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. If Canada decides to reroute those exports to Asia and Europe instead, and Carney has signaled this is on the table, American refineries don't just face higher prices. They face structural shortfalls they cannot easily replace. And if you work in defense or aerospace, Canada is one of America's most critical partners in NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. If this relationship continues to deteriorate, the logistics of Arctic defense, surveillance, early warning, rapid deployment become dramatically more expensive and operationally fragile for both countries. One detail that the financial press rushed past: the $35 billion Arctic plan includes civilian infrastructure too, airport upgrades in Rankin Inlet and Inuvik, a Mackenzie Valley highway that would, for the first time, provide an overland connection from Yellowknife to a deep-water Arctic port, a Grays Bay road and port that would become Canada's first overland link to the Arctic Ocean, opening up critical mineral exports and military logistics simultaneously. This is dual-use infrastructure. It serves communities, it serves the economy, and it serves the Canadian Armed Forces. Force multipliers, Carney called them. While the trade war dominates headlines, Canada is building roads to the ocean. Now, a word about Carney himself, because it matters to understanding the weight of what's happening. Mark Carney is not a politician who stumbled into an economic crisis. He is one of the most respected central bankers of his generation. He led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial collapse. He led the Bank of England through Brexit. He has sat at the table with the IMF, the G7, the G20, and the Financial Stability Board. He knows how sovereign currency crises start. He knows what economic contagion looks like before it hits the headlines. And he is treating this moment, Trump's trade war, the Arctic pressure, Russia's shadow fleet, the deterioration of the Western alliance, with the exact level of urgency that someone who has actually managed a financial crisis brings to the table. He was in Japan last week, signing expanded trade and defense agreements with Tokyo. He was in Australia before that, cementing trans-Pacific relationships. He was in Norway this weekend with German and Nordic leaders, formalizing a new architecture of Arctic security. The Canada-Nordic summit that accompanied his Norway visit was the first by a Canadian Prime Minister to the Nordic region in decades. He is not reacting. He is building, methodically, quietly, with the precision of someone who has spent a career understanding that the window to act before a crisis peaks is always shorter than people think. The countries Carney is connecting, Japan, Australia, Germany, Norway, the UK, are not just political allies. They are economic counterweights. Together, they represent an alternative trading architecture that Canada is actively constructing, one that would reduce Canadian dependence on the U.S. market from its current level of roughly 75% of total exports to something significantly more diversified. Once those trade relationships mature, once Canadian critical minerals are flowing to Japanese battery manufacturers, once Canadian LNG is linked to German and Nordic energy grids, the leverage equation inverts. The U.S. cannot threaten Canada with tariffs if Canada has alternative customers waiting. That is the long game Carney is playing, and he is playing it faster than anyone expected. Let me be honest about where this goes, because clarity matters more than comfort here. I see two paths and no middle road. Path 1. Cooler heads prevail, and quickly. The Section 122 tariffs expire in July without Congress extending them. The Section 301 investigations drag on through their legally required public consultation periods. In that window, U.S. Trade Representative Greer and Canada's negotiating team reach a framework agreement on the CUSMA review. Canada makes modest concessions on dairy supply management, perhaps some symbolic gestures on digital services. The U.S. gets a face-saving headline. Canada locks in its existing export relationships and continues building its Arctic infrastructure at a measured pace. Tension remains, but the economic catastrophe is avoided. Both sides step back from the ledge. Path 2. The investigations conclude on an accelerated timeline. Greer said a matter of months, and meant it. New Section 301 tariffs hit Canadian goods in late summer or early fall. Canada responds with its own retaliatory package targeting American goods in politically sensitive U.S. states. The CUSMA review becomes a battlefield. Canadian exports pivot toward Asia and Europe more aggressively than planned. American refineries start facing supply crunches. Energy prices spike heading into the U.S. midterm cycle. And in the background, Russia keeps moving oil through its shadow fleet, Iran keeps hitting Gulf infrastructure, North Korea keeps testing missiles, the G7 keeps fracturing, and the Arctic, where Canada, Russia, and an increasingly nervous United States all have overlapping claims and interests, becomes the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. Nobody wins Path 2, not Canada, not the United States, not the Alliance. But 3 months ago, I didn't think we'd be here at all. And here we are. So the question stands, is Carney building a wall or building a bridge? Is Trump's trade strategy rational economic nationalism, or is it something more dangerous, a dismantling of the very alliances that gave the West its security architecture for 80 years? And when this finally resolves, which country comes out stronger?